just because the starting running backs are cheaper does not make them good plays, because other players also exist at those same prices, and they will still be better for your team if the starter loses his job. And if the starting running back, and maybe the very easiest heuristic for thinking through whether or not a running back is a dead zone running back is just to ask yourself that very simple question of whether, not that it's possible, but that it seems very realistic that the starter will lose his job without injury. And when we work through this, I'm going to kind of rapid fire take these at you, and you can jump in anytime I get one like completely and totally wrong. But we're at running back 11, Isaiah Pacheco. I'm going to say no there, simply because the Chiefs have gone so far out of their way to make sure there is no talent on that depth chart that could compete with him. I mean, the Chiefs are basically the Dallas Cowboys from a running back depth chart perspective. It's that bad. So I think that he is safe.
I agree with that, but I will say that that's why he's going RB11. He continues to rise because people are like, there's no competition here, but not necessarily because of him, which is a big dead zone marker. It's not the player, it's the situation. Now that's a problem.
Completely agree. Josh Jacobs, I mean, I think people, because he had the good 2022, there's a denial about just how bad he has been in the other seasons, and 2023 was the worst. It was catastrophic. He could easily lose the starting job without injury. Rachaad White could easily lose without injury. That one, I think I'm just flat out projecting. It's one of the reasons why I have so much Bucky Irving. I think Cook is okay. Joe Mixon, granted, yeah, you don't have a good backup, but Joe Mixon is not good. Could lose it to Dameon Pierce without injury. The main thing for Pierce seems to be an awkward fit in the style of offense. I'd like to think that the Houston coaches could work through that. Kamara could. Walker is basically already in a committee. Stevenson, I don't think that Antonio Gibson is an NFL caliber player at this point. But
I'm going to say, yes, he could lose it, because I don't know that Stevenson's like that much more efficient. And Gibson's size, speed stuff, there's probably still a ceiling to be told.
Well, one of the things about kind of the conversation we had earlier with ETN and his backups was also there with Stevenson and Elliott, where I mean, Elliott was still so much worse that it reinforces for you just how bad that Patriots offense was. But I mean, it's going to be bad again. Aaron Jones, I think, is a stud who, I mean, he's old, but Ben, if you're looking for like a precision play in the dead zone, that one appeals to me. Zamir White, the Raiders are a terrible team that has a running back depth chart that is like the Chiefs and the Cowboys. Could he still lose?
So
he could obviously lose.
He could still lose it, but I have been vaguely interested in Zamir White purely because the only guy that's coming for, I mean, like, we can talk ourselves into Dylan Laube, but like the guy that's going to get the first opportunity is really bad. Alexander Madison is not going to go win that job.
Well, and I mean, Dylan Laube is a poor man's Evan Hall, who people are somehow putting behind Trey Sermon in Indianapolis. But I would note that even though Zamir White put up some good scores at the end of the season, his peripherals are down there in that Saquon Barkley range, which does concern me a little bit. He's a guy with plus speed at his size, but was really not a very good college player. And
this is like the fourth
big injury elements, but I mean, his main thing is he's going to take the handoff and run straight forward as fast as he can with size. And sometimes that does work, but does it work consistently in a terrible offense? I mean, that part is tricky.
This is like the fourth player where you've started to go through each of them, and I want you to keep going because this is a great point. But this is like the fourth player where we've been like, this player, if there was a good backup, we would probably be projecting the backup to just take the role. But there's just no one necessarily that's good enough to take it. That, I go all the way back to the first time I wrote about the dead zone, and I mentioned this on another pod recently, but I wrote about Alex Collins, who was a top 100 pick the year prior. And in the introduction of this piece, it was sent to me recently. I reread the introduction. I was like, this is such a great note, because it was like, the example that I had pulled from the season prior was that Alex Collins was a top 100 pick because projections said he was going to get all this work, and nobody could foresee that undrafted free agent Gus Edwards would get 150 rush attempts. So like some of these situations where we're talking about a Dylan Laube or whatever, it's not even necessarily that player takes over everything, but if a UDFA in some of these backfields that we're not even really thinking about yet, or gets added later or something, comes in and has 100 carries at some point, that wouldn't be that surprising. And that changes the overall workload for the full season dramatically. If somebody takes 100 carries that we're not even talking about, right? Like that's a big amount of the overall work. And so Gus Edwards is, a name at this point that we all know very, very well, but going into the rookie season his rookie season was a UDFA, didn't play, was born in Liberia, has an interesting background. We didn't know a lot about him. He winds up being and so Alex Collins was the guys like the Zamir White of this year, who had done well the end of the year prior. And so he seemed like the lead back for the Ravens going into the next season. And I think Zamir White is the lead back for the Raiders going into this season. But if he's not good, you're talking about his peripherals are bad, they will look for other answers in season. Teams don't just play bad players for a whole season and not even look for other answers unless it's Rachaad White.
And so, we have some skepticism there. This isn't a fantasy football note, but I will kind of throw out there that some of the things I've read about Zamir White off the field make me think that he is a fantastic human being. And I certainly hope that I am wrong and he has a huge year, because that would just simply be really, really cool. The next one here, James Conner. Then I'm going to throw out, and again, probably is going to sound silly, but the Saquon Barkley and James Conner's ADPs should be reversed. James Conner, fantastic peripherals last season, led the NFL in yards after contact per attempt. He's 29, but I mean, he's one of the guys where you look at his recent production and it's extremely impressive. You look at his last 3 seasons, he's averaging over 16 points per game. He's over 40% RB1 finishes. And we expect the Cardinals to be a much improved offense and perhaps a fantastic rushing offense.
Yeah. Perhaps a surprise team of the whole year in terms of, when I've gone through my projections, we mentioned this on a recent show, but they're one that was hard for me to get down to market expectations. I would be like willing to take overs on Arizona, in different ways. I think this is going to be a really fun offense.
So for me, like Aaron Jones, James Conner would be one of those precision targets in the dead zone. It's weird to say that because you think of a 29-year-old running back who is not objectively fast and has an interesting rookie drafted into his backfield. And the very first thing you think from all the rules of thumb that you have in place over time is that he's under big threat, and he may turn out to be. But that one is an interesting one to me. David Montgomery is actually a backup. DeAndre Swift, lose the job purely on talent early in the season. I'm rooting against it, but that one, again, very straightforward. Could easily do that.
Yep.
I mean, Jonathan Brooks coming off of the injury, not as good as Chuba Hubbard is in an improved Panthers offense. Very possible. Najee Harris.
Yeah,
go ahead.
If he's not, because he's coming off the injury, like they just bring him along slower or whatever, right? And they're just like, okay, if Hubbard's playing really well, like that one's already like Hubbard might already be playing more in week 1. And so if he's playing really well, you get like a poor man's version of what happened to Jonathan Taylor a little bit when he came back and the Colts were like, well, we can't just take Zach Moss off the field because he's been playing really well while you're gone. And they eventually sort of did. But that was with Jonathan Taylor being Jonathan Taylor already. With a rookie, if the backup is playing well, like he could just keep the rookie from playing a lot longer than we want.
And when you think about explosiveness, Chuba had one of the top boom rates in the entire NFL last year. There were a lot of other things that went wrong, but if that offense is better, he's someone who, like you say, could do exactly what you just suggested. We get a little bit further there, and Raheem Mostert a backup, Jaylen Warren a backup or committee guy. Zach Moss, pretty straightforward that he would lose the starting job on talent. Tony Pollard, I mean, the next guy is his committee mate, but Pollard, not just like for when we get into this range, it's a question too of not just like losing the starting job, but losing almost all of the work, right? When you're thinking about the dynamic with a Jalen Warren versus Harris, a Tony Pollard versus Spears, what you're really talking about there is not like losing the nominal starting job, but going from 50-50 to like 65-35, which would make those picks catastrophic. You had the two Commanders backs in there. For what reason, I have no idea. And then we kind of move into round 9 and out of the range where we're kind of discussing this dead zone element. But you work through that, and Ben, it's just player after player after player where you're like, yeah, I mean, from a talent perspective, these guys are in big trouble just right off the bat.
And what drives home this point of how many ambiguous backfields there are and all this stuff is you just mentioned as you got through the end of the 7th and the early 8th, like Jonathan Brooks was I was just going to say how many backfields we got the first back from that backfield drafted very late. So Jonathan Brooks was the first Panther. And I guess right before him, Swift was the first Bear. Najee Harris is the first Steeler. There's a couple going in that range. Zach Moss is the first Bengal. We get both the Titans backs. We get both the Commanders backs. And you're thinking, okay, well, that's like all the offenses, right? But not really, because if you go into the 9th round, you still have Devin Singletary as the first Giant back in the next round. You have Javonte Williams after that. And that's a backfield we are targeting. We think is very valuable. He's the first Bronco back to come off. If you're going to tell me that no Broncos are going to be productive out of that backfield, I would be very surprised. But there's 2 more backfields that I would say make the same comment about that are coming up still, maybe 3. Nick Chubb at the end of the 9th round is the first Brown back to go off the board. That's a good offense that likes to run the ball. Whoever is playing at running back for that offense is probably going to be scoring points. Is that Jerome Ford early in the year? I don't know. I'm not drafting a lot of Ford because I do think Chubb could come back and like make it a problem in the later part of the season. But if you're doing a 0 RB build and you want to get off to a fast start, like, yeah, probably Jerome Ford's going to be playing a decent amount early in the year for a good team and probably getting good work.
And we think about this dynamic as it kind of cascades down. And as we're looking at different price points and where do you want to either target or avoid, there's also sort of this stealth dynamic of if the starter is going to be out, maybe for half the season, maybe for 3/4 of the season, and that becomes relevant because now you're actually the starter. I am not in on Deontay Foreman, but I do think it's incumbent on me to note that Jerome Ford's points earned per play last season, according to SIS with some of their advanced charting, is sandwiched in between Ezekiel Elliott and Dameon Pierce. So some of that is covered up by workload. Some of it's covered up by the Browns' context and backfield situation. If you're drafting Jerome Ford, you need to be going into it with open eyes and thinking maybe he takes a step forward. Maybe it flat out doesn't matter, but you have serious talent risks when you're taking a guy who, Ben, I just have to continue to say I have no idea what the situation is going to be with Nick Chubb. Obviously, the history of serious injuries like that is very disconcerting. At the same time, we do have these epic recoveries, and at least on the very surface, he seems to be, maybe in the midst of that. And again, not to say he's going to go out and do an Adrian Peterson week 1, but when you're talking about mid-season, right? If he's the guy mid-season, you can't draft a bad back like Jerome Ford at this price when there are other running backs you could pick and there are other positions you have to address.
Right. And that's why they're going so late. And at the same time, if we zoom out, we can say pretty definitively that Browns running backs are going to have usable weeks this season. And whether that's, Nick Chubb down the stretch, whether that's Jerome Ford early based on volume alone, he had some last year, even with those poor peripherals that you mentioned, whether that's Deontay Foreman. And one of the reasons I'm not taking a lot of Browns backs is I think there's even sneaky, like there's already been a lot of really positive reports that Pierre Strong is going to probably make this roster because of special teams. I've seen a couple times this offseason that he's one of the
But Pierre Strong is the best player on that roster. It obviously has never mattered. It's not going to matter.
Right. It may not matter at all. But if he makes the team, there's another name. And then
you're throwing notes out there that go like directly to the depths of my soul.
Yeah. He's a tricky one. to discuss. I know it's painful, but him and Nyheim Hines as well is another name there. So yeah, it's complicated, but someone's probably going to score. If you're in a managed league and you want to go really hardcore 0 RB and just try to get it right with like Deontay Foreman, like it wouldn't be that surprising. And again, I was mentioning how after you stopped the dead zone thing, we still had Singletary as the first back for the Giants, and we had Javonte Williams as the first back for the Broncos, and then we had Chubb and the Browns. There's still 2 more teams. You still have the Cowboys, where Ezekiel Elliott finally comes off as the first back for that team, and nobody wants to touch any of their backs because no one thinks they're any good, but that's a really good offense. There's probably going to be running back touchdowns to be had there, if nothing else. And then you still have the Chargers, who no one wants to draft Justin Herbert this year because they're going to have such a heavy run rate. And I mean, I'm concerned about Gus Edwards too, but there's going to be scoring in Jim Harbaugh's running back room, whether that's Gus Edwards, who's the last of the 32 lead runners by ADP to finally come off the board near the end of the 10th round, whether that's him or the exciting rookie Kamani Vidal, or it's J.K. Dobbins making a comeback from, what is it now? Is it 2 Achilles tears now, or he had an ACL first and then an Achilles? He's had just so many injuries. But whatever ends up, whether that's Isaiah Spiller, I don't know, right? Like it could be a lot of things, but the point is, this is an important dynamic to talk through. I'm not saying to go out and chase the Browns backs. I'm not saying to go out and chase the Cowboys or the Chargers backs. I am saying that I'm highly confident that there's going to be points from the running back position late. And whether it's from those offenses or some of the other ambiguous offenses that don't have very good starters that we talked about, there are so many situations here that then makes it that much harder to justify chasing limited ceiling players in the dead zone that drafters are not willing to push up, even though they're willing to push up Saquon Barkley and then Derrick Henry immediately. And look, Henry, we've mentioned a couple times. It's just worth noting that he's very, old. He's on the wrong side of the age curve. There's a lot of reasons that he could be very efficient as a rusher this year with Lamar Jackson, and he could, in terms of yards per carry, and then could also have a lot of touchdowns. But I kind of doubt he's going to lead the NFL in rush attempts again, which he's done like 4 out of the last 5 years, solely because they do like to use Lamar to run with design runs a decent amount, and they like to use some other backs. They've talked a lot about giving Henry a ton of work. It will be surprising to me if he leads the NFL in rush attempts. I'll just say that, because they are trying to throw a little bit more too in this Todd Monken offense. And then secondly, the receiving, which has never really been there for Henry and has never really been there for Lamar Jackson's running backs, where, again, he's going to be a vertical read, then run kind of a quarterback, not check down kind of quarterback. So just from a profile perspective, with age and everything else factored in, Henry going in the second round and some of these redraft stuff in a full PPR site with tight end premium, where the opportunity cost is an elite tight end, that just tells you, like, it's if drafters were really buying into Isaiah Pacheco, he'd be there, right, in ADP. He'd be in the middle of the second round. If they're really buying into Rachaad White, he'd be in the second round. But they don't. If they're buying into Joe Mixon, he would be going up there. They don't see any real ceiling. They see small win potential, strong workloads. These guys can be usable pieces to my starting lineup, which is the same trick that has led to the landmines in the dead zone over and over again throughout time. You're not even getting the upside to justify the risk. You might not hit that landmine, but you're making a bet that's a small win, big loss bet, and make too many of those bets and you're going to lose in fantasy football. That's not the way to win. We constantly talk about small loss, big hit as the bet that you want to be making. And so if you are going to take a running back in those ranges, you should be taking the ones that are like committee backs and things like that as well. Like Devon Achane is a guy that you can bet on and say, well, the one thing that's holding him down is not efficiency. He had a freaking 8 yard per carry rate or whatever, or 10 yards per carry or whatever it was last year. I mean, the guy was insane. It's that people don't think he's going to get enough work. Kenneth Walker, the thing that's holding him down is not that people think he's bad. It's that he's just a full-blown committee back already at this point. At least, bet on the projections being wrong in a way that there's talent to maybe justify some upside beyond that. But you can't go chase these traditional dead zone backs. Alvin Kamara, he caught a ton of balls again last year, but was that a positive for the Saints offense, or was that just they had nothing else to go? And they got a new coordinator for the first time. They still had Pete Carmichael there, Sean Payton's longtime coordinator, with a lot of the dump offs and the running back passing. It's always been a staple of that offense. Does it change a little bit under Clint Kubiak? Is there things a little bit different for Kamara's receiving role. But more importantly, he was not efficient as a runner. You talked about a lot of the peripherals for like a Saquon and stuff. We haven't talked a lot about Kamara. I'll just mention his peripherals have declined 4 years in a row. His missed tackles force, his yards after contact declined. And they are now like half of what they used to be per touch. He's just not the same back. He doesn't make the guys miss the same way. He doesn't have the same ability to hit the explosives. And you're not going to get, I don't think that coming back at this age for him. So that's a player that, I'm taking a lot of Kendra Miller for that reason, but that's a player that's going in that range. It's a small miss player, but where you can have, a small hit player. I don't think you're going to get that elite Alvin Kamara. History tells us you're chasing something that's not coming back when you take a former elite talent in the dead zone like Kamara this year. Is very similar to what people were telling themselves with Zeke, not last year, but the year prior. It is last year in Dallas that he was still going to be that guy in round 5. At any point, at any rate, what I'm trying to say is you can't take guys that you think are small hit players based on workload alone when they don't have the efficiency to be big wins in a season where this much running back scoring could happen late. They're so like it's just it has to come from somewhere in the later rounds. Anyway, that's the biggest thing about the dead zone I want to reinforce this here.
And just one little note there on Kamara. His numbers were absolutely insane, right? Where when you think about what Achane did, and some people want to tell you that there's no way he could do it again. And I say some people, I just mean that it's a very reasonable statement to make that Achane is going to have a hard time hitting the same levels of efficiency again. Very reasonable. I don't want to make that sound like a silly argument. But Alvin Kamara, 103 fantasy points over expectation as a rookie. 50 points over his second year, 95 points over in 2020. And then, as you mentioned, 3 consecutive years in the negative. I mean, this isn't somebody who, is declining exact. This is someone who has become a completely different back. Now, that back is still a viable NFL player. And so we want to give him credit for still being a viable NFL player because that is an incredibly high standard. But Alvin Kamara was, Achane with a workload. And so
right.
You have to understand that it's very different now. My question for you there in terms of distilling some of the comments and making sure I'm understanding where you're going with them in terms of how you specifically are thinking about the dead zone. Because again, not that having done such fantastic research on the dead zone, kind of starting out this discussion, makes it so that you're the only, resource on this. But I do think you kind of have a special place in the discussion. And you kind of pushed back early when I mentioned Barkley as being a dead zone guy, and you're saying this, round 2 area. But you've also kind of mentioned Derrick Henry as being a dead zone guy. And you mentioned this fact that 2019 to 2022, you don't get the reinforcements. And so as I'm thinking about, whether it's legendary upside, whether it's tournament winning potential from an EP perspective, when we're thinking about the guys who can get us to that 23 to 25 point per game range. And one of the things I would just note too, is it gets hard, right? The thing that jumped out to me when I was working on that Broncos piece and talking about where Sean Payton's offenses have been in terms of receiving EP over average is just how much the average receiving EP to the running backs from a team level perspective had fallen off in 2023 from what we kind of think of as, or what I kind of think of as this kind of recent golden age of the Uber back in that like 2016, 2017, 2018 time period where you were actually getting some really big receiving EP numbers. I mean, those numbers aren't there as much anymore, which means not only do you not have the reinforcements, and maybe it comes down to the fact that you don't have the backs who can do it, but the round 1 should be the guys who have that EP profile that says, I'm going to win you your league. I'm going to win you your tournament. Round 2 should be the guys that you're betting on going there the next year, but we don't have those bets. Is that kind of how you see it?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the exception in round 2 is I'm taking some Jonathan Taylor in the early part of round 2, and I'm taking some Achane in the late part of round 2, and I'm taking some Kyron into round 3 now over on Underdog. But those are the 3 names that I'm still willing to take some of. And then there are, and I've taken some ETN in round 4. There are situations where I'll consider like a falling James Cook or a falling Joe Mixon, or I mean Isaiah Pacheco is a name that I would throw into that group if the price was right enough in a very wide receiver heavy room. But like you just don't get those prices anymore. Those guys are actually starting to rise a little bit. Pacheco's starting to rise. It would need to be in like the 6th round for me to consider that. I'm not saying I'd be completely out on them, but they're, to me, the small win play where I don't get enough of a benefit to justify it at their cost typically. And then there's the other ones like Kamara that that's a falling knife to me that I'm not taking even when they fall. So I guess that's a reasonable distinction to make. But like Rachaad White's one that I took once this offseason and I was like immediately regretted it. It's like, I'm not going to do that again, which is not, I mean, like I took him like 10 or 15 picks after ADP. I think the workload's good enough in best ball that if you get a really low price that you can say, okay, this type of small win can be a usable piece in best ball. But especially when you start to talk about the redraft side of it, most of those names that I'm mentioning now, I don't even think are really draftable in redraft outside of situations where you're like, yeah, but I'm playing with all my friends and neighbors and running backs go crazy high and I can just get so many receivers late. It's not even competitive how many receivers I can get into the 10th, 11th, and 12th round. Then like, okay, fine. You can take that detour. You can go try to build in some running back touches early, try to get that small win running back early. I still would prefer a 1-for-1 bet on the receiver. I would be very discerning about that. I think when I hear that point, that specific point about I can get so many receivers late, I think people overplay that and they take a couple running backs early, and then the only receivers they get late are ones that don't, I mean, they're not, even within the wide receiver window, the bets get weaker. It's hard to hit on a wide receiver breakout from round 7 or round 8 in any format at any time. The very best receivers go in rounds 1 and 2 and 3. And then it's just sort of a downward scale from there. We do sometimes get these really nice prices that we can bet on in rounds 4 and 5 and 6 and things like that. And then eventually the upside for wide receiver just closes entirely. So you do want to make the rookie and second year bets in round 7 and 8 when you can, but you can hit Quentin Johnson and Sky Moore and all those guys in that round. We've seen that. You can also hit Garrett Wilson and rookie year Justin Jefferson in that round as well. So that's why, we continue to say you do want to take those upside wide band players in that range. Sometimes you miss on them though. And I don't think you want to just rely on being able to hit on all of those in these home leagues is my point. Because again, in the home leagues, I get this, I can get enough depth of that type. I can get enough depth of the, JSN bet. So I'm going to take running backs early, and you're losing something still when you take Saquon Barkley over, Puka Nacua at the end of your first round. Like, you're definitely losing something. You should just take Puka Nacua. Like, that's a better player that's going to do better for your build. But yeah, in terms of how I'm playing it, I think it's really, really difficult this year to be anywhere close to even with the field, like ownership percentage wise on running backs in the top like 6 or 7 rounds collectively. I think you need to be underweight on the collective. And so the ones that I'm actually taking, I'm being very discerning about. And specifically, I'm now in this batch of drafts that I just signed up for, going out of my way to, I'm certainly taking Christian McCaffrey when I have the opportunity, going out of my way to get some more Breece Hall. I've been taking some Bijan, a little bit higher on Bijan than Breece, but getting some anchor running back builds with each of those 3 who I'm very high on. I've taken some Gibbs, taken a little bit of Taylor, Achane, and Kyron, but very rarely on the same, like very rarely taking 2 running backs. I did it a couple times just to kind of see how those builds go in like the slow puppy drafts, not so much in the BBM drafts. And then again, I'm just basically not considering clicking, even when they fall, Isaiah Pacheco, Josh Jacobs, Rachaad White, James Cook, Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara. And you can tell me that might be wrong, and I'll suffer for that. But I think it's pretty straightforward that you need to be getting as much receiver depth and firepower as you can in those ranges. And if you're not doing that, that you then need to be taking an elite tight end.
The first thing that's going to jump out to people who are viewing your redraft board here, Ben, is that your 2 favorite receivers are standing right there in round 7, the round you just impugned from a receiver perspective, Deontay Johnson and Rashee Rice. As we look at this from that redraft perspective before kind of wrapping up with the best ball, do you like or do you see the QBs as viable, impactful selections in that 4, 5, 6 range that is such a clear overlap with the weakest part of the dead zone? So the name that I want to throw in before we get to that, kind of as we transition, the back that I would name as the most likely for me to be the person to take a jump is Kenneth Walker. And I mention him because he has the sub 4.4 speed. And even in a season last year where a lot of the actual results were gross, he had fantastic peripherals. You watch Kenneth Walker play, he does run side to side a lot, but he's just so explosive that unlike most other backs, he can get away from it, away with it. The problem, Ben, is that even last year when he wasn't really in a committee, he was below 13 expected points per game. And there's really only one game in there that was a super low snap game, an injury game, right? So maybe you move it up a little bit, say full snaps, it's higher, but that's not anywhere close to where you would need to be from a volume perspective to have even a fantastic efficiency year work for you. And so the name that is the best positioned to take a talent-based and relatively youth-based jump is stuck. And it's always a problem when you're looking at a guy in the dead zone and you like their talent, but that player would need an injury to unlock them. When we're talking about players being unlocked by injury, it almost exclusively needs to be backs that you're paying those double-digit prices for, where they're the backup who's more talented than the starter, and then you can unlock them and then you win big. It's very different when you're Kenneth Walker and you're saying this guy could be awesome if Zach Charbonnet gets hurt.
I think that's a great case on Walker. You were asking about the quarterbacks. I actually want to hear your thoughts on that. And I just gave a lot of thoughts about the ways that I'm playing and which running backs I'm playing. And so rather than answer any of your questions, I'm just going to ask you to answer a similar type of question to what I just asked you. I'm really curious, like, do you agree with what I just laid out in terms of how to play those running backs? I was talking through it pretty particularly on Underdog. Obviously, you might have different thoughts in different formats. Are there any other than Walker, who is one that I intentionally didn't mention as guys that I'm never clicking when I went through some of the other names? Are there any others that I didn't talk about or skipped over or that I am playing that you're maybe not playing? And like, do you tend to agree with, like, structurally speaking, what I was saying about being pretty underweight on the first 7 round running backs collectively? And then I want to hear your thoughts. You mentioned a little bit about it pre-show to me about the quarterback position. And I kind of said to you, I hadn't really thought through it as well as you said. I tend to not think about the quarterback position at all. I just have this hole in my analysis where I'm like, I'll just figure out quarterback whenever I decide to figure it out, and I just don't think about it a ton. But I'm curious your approach at quarterback in these ranges. You know, how that factors into the opportunity cost discussion.
So the foundation of this entire discussion about the running back dead zone, and if it exists in 2024, is based in the history that you have outlined so clearly for us, but then the premise that because the backs are cheaper in 2024, it doesn't matter or it doesn't exist. And the data would suggest that it's exactly the opposite. And I think it ties into both of the questions because the contrasts are so interesting here. When we look at the QBs in the FFPC Fantasy Pros contest here, where you have Allen, Hurts, and Mahomes in round 4, Jackson in 5, and Richardson and Stroud in round 6 and 7, the dynamic that comes up in best ball is that you simply still can't afford them. Jake Bose has done a fantastic simulation looking at what you need from the receiver position in best ball and what you would need as ADP moves in the direction it's moving. And the answer is that you need the receivers even more.
The window just it just closes earlier. Like you just have less of an opportunity to get enough receivers.
Michael Dubner has put together 2 separate articles looking at this, working through the history and then how you need to execute it in 2024. And his conclusion is that you want to be the Avalanche, right? You yourself, you can't get caught in it. You want to be it. The RotoViz Underdog Roster Construction Explorer shows that if you have the 6 receivers in the first 7 rounds last year, your advance rates across the board are sensational.
And I just really, you're saying all this great research on this. I really want to emphasize the why as I understand it, because people are like, you guys just hate running backs. You're obviously tilting the way you're thinking about this, what have you. The why is when you think about early rounds and late rounds, what can you get scoring wise in the early rounds that you can't get in the late rounds? And what you can't get is the elite wide receiver upside reliably. What you can get in the late rounds is running back scoring. And I've made the case on this long episode, maybe one of the earlier episodes of the shorts, but I've made the case today that you're likely going to get running back scoring late this year based on the way the landscape sets up. And as you just said, the fact that running backs are going later than ever, it just means that there's going to be running back scoring late. The more that wide receivers push up, yes, that makes running back more appealing from a pure value perspective in the early rounds. But there's always a trade-off to then what you have to do with your build in the late rounds. And every time you take a running back in the early rounds, you now have to take a receiver in the late rounds and tell yourself that you're going to get ceiling out of that. And I've started to see people talk about on Twitter that, some of these late round receivers hit, they're going to change the whole thing. They're not going to hit in the upside kind of way that you're thinking. I mean, it just doesn't happen reliably at the wide receiver position. We have so much data, and especially as wide receivers continue to push up, you're talking about the wide receiver 50 going in round 9 or whatever, right? And so you're starting to talk about the weaker and weaker bets at the wide receiver position, both profile wise and the offenses that they're in. There's the haves and the have-nots. We know what offenses we want to target. ADP is reliably good at identifying the receivers to get, and as they get more and more expensive, that question of what can you get in the early rounds that you can't get later, it's so clearly wide receiver, and it's so clearly not running back. When you start thinking about like tight end, I would make a little, there's been late round tight ends that have hit in the past. That strategy has worked, including last year. I would make the case that for 2024, this is a little more ambiguous. You also can't get that this year, that you want to be targeting earlier tight ends, but that's more of an analytical, that's not as black and white. It's more of a case that I'm trying to build in my mind. What's very straightforward is you can't get the wide receiver ceiling the way that you can get running back points late.
And so when you're building these teams and you need to have that receiving firepower, in best ball, you can't even afford the quarterbacks. Which then we get this switch into redraft where we're now going to be making our starting lineup decisions, and we can only start a certain number of wide receivers every week. In FFPC, it's 2-2-2. So if you hit on a season, like in 2016, coming off the running back apocalypse, where that was a very unique confluence of events, where because of the running back apocalypse changing ADP, and then because 2016 was also extremely favorable for early running backs, both from a scoring and a health perspective, you had these dynamic teams that were running back heavy, and where running backs in your redraft leagues could fill your flexes. And you have the 4 starting running backs in your lineup, and you have these unstoppable juggernauts. For all of the reasons we've discussed to this point in the show, that running back scoring is not likely to come out of those rounds this year. And so if you have a 4 running back lineup, which I do think will be possible, but it's just going to come from different rounds. And so it would allow you to do other things like take one of these big time QBs and get that scoring advantage. But then the issue for me always kind of comes back to, do I want to get one of these stars who could have a season where you get up in that 27, 28 point per game range? All you have to do to find that is really go back to 2022, right? And that was the season that kind of spawned last year's elite QB discussion. We could have those kinds of seasons, but if you ask me to take one of those players versus building, sort of this QB Hydra where we have a Jaden Daniels, a Caleb Williams, and then perhaps, even a Bo Nix at the very, very end, you can take 2 or 3 guys. Now, the problem with that is that it does overlap with this 9 through 11 range where there are interesting backs. But our exercise when we worked through 9 through 11 was that we found that probably a lot of those offenses are still going to get their starting scoring from rounds 12 through 15. But I think you can end up with a very running back heavy overall build in your redraft teams, but where almost none of it comes from the early rounds. Right? If you want to end up with a team that has more running backs than receivers, you can do that. You just want to make sure that you have the early receivers. One of the things we've always talked about with Zero RB is try and get 6 of the top 15 wide receivers. Well, you can no longer do that. And there are reasons why that can mitigate some of the flex opportunity. But at the same time, if you're targeting the right profiles, then you can still and need to load up early, mixing it with those elite tight ends. And that to me is still the way to play redraft this year, because we don't have a mix of really good running back targets. Last year, I mentioned early at the very top of the show, like 6 or 7 names that we had targeted, and most of them hit. This year, the guys that we're interested in are more expensive. They're coming more at the 2-3 turn, which is not really the way I want to do it. And there aren't as many. And so if you have a name, you can mix that in, but you want to make sure you don't mix that name in at such a rate that, that's your guy and you don't have a lot of receivers there as well. There's just so much more that you can do when you have 6 or 7 names to play with. You do not have 6 or 7 names to play with this season, and you want to be taking tight ends there.
And what you just said about that way to play redraft, I do think to put a bow on everything we've talked about, it just feels very straightforward. You really want to hammer wide receivers in the early rounds, especially in redraft, man, where you can play the waiver wire. You can pick up whatever wide receiver is, replacement level if you need some receiver depth. Like you could just draft 5 receivers in a normal redraft league, or maybe 6, depending on how deep the benches are. As you said that, I was thinking of the first sort of redraft league that I'm drafting on my own is the Scott Fish Bowl. It's a much different format. But still some of the structural rules are going to apply. There's super flex, there's tight end premium stuff though as well. In mine, I took Bijan Robinson in the first round. I took 2 quarterbacks reasonably early and 2 tight ends reasonably early. And then I took 5 straight receivers. And at the end of round 10, I still had 5 receivers. The last one was Roma Dunze. So it was like all kind of before the wide receiver window closed. I still got Jalen Waddle in the 6th because it's a different format. But the reason I bring this up is the point you just made about taking a bunch of running backs. From the 11th round to the 17th, I've taken running backs in 6 of the 7 rounds. Like, I don't need to take receivers after the receiver window closes. I don't want to. I'm not worried about it. That maybe isn't the perfect example because that is a very unique format. But to your point, when it plays that way in redraft, I'm very comfortable. Through 10 rounds, I had 1 running back and 5 receivers, and I already have more running backs than receivers, and we'll probably finish even more extreme towards that direction in that format, because you can play off the waiver wire in these redraft formats. I just think in any home league or anything like that, it makes so much sense to be really strong with elite receivers and an elite tight end potentially. and maybe even the quarterback, right? But you mentioned how it's still so hard to do in best ball to take the quarterback, but in redraft possible. It's just, and then you just play running back so heavily late, knowing that there's going to be running back points coming from somewhere this year in the late rounds. I want to find this year's Raheem Mostert. He's probably not going to exist. There's probably not going to be a 20 touchdown scorer in the 15th round. But one of the ways I get close to that, to finding that, is I take 6 of the running backs in that range in every draft, or I take 8 of them even. In past years, Shawn, in some of the leagues that we've built in redraft, we've gone extreme the other way, where we've maybe only taken like 3 running backs to start. And we're like, we're just going to play running back off the waiver wire. We want to build everything else into this team. And we took some early backs and we just stopped at 3. And that's how you can do redraft sometimes too. This year, to me, it's the opposite. You're not going to get everything right in a redraft build. You're going to have to cut stuff in season. You're going to have to churn on the waiver wire. To me, it's like, I still want to make sure I get enough early receivers, because some of those are going to be wrong. Want to build in some contingencies. Like you said, you're trying to get 6 top 15 receivers. But, if you wanted to be a little bit extreme and only take 5 early receivers, for example, based on room and based on what's available and all of those things, I think in most casual leagues and even in most competitive leagues, you can at least get to 6 early receivers and still get an elite tight end and probably still get an elite quarterback, because you can still get a pretty good receiver in the 8th round in most. But through 8 rounds, to have a quarterback, a tight end, and 6 receivers, and then just hammer running back. I mean, it's different if you did take a Christian McCaffrey or a Bijan or a Breece Hall in the 1st round. At any rate, you're somewhere in that ballpark through 9 or 10 rounds, and then you are just taking all of the running backs you can imagine late and trying to find roles early in the season that are more valuable than expected, because they're going to exist, man. Like, I'm looking at this team that I drafted for the Scott Fish Bowl. It's got Jaylen Warren in the 11th. Obviously, he's going to have a role. We feel that way. Chase Brown is the next one. And people have made, I think, some solid arguments against Chase Brown. I've tried to argue that people don't recognize how much of a workhorse he was in college. He had, I think it was a dozen games where he had 25 plus touches and he had 120 yards in every one of them. I mean, he was consistently the centerpiece of his Illinois offense in college. I took Marshawn Lloyd, Kendre Miller. I even took Rico Dowdle in this format. Shawn, I know you're not super into him, but somebody's got to produce in Dallas, right? Then I took Kamani Vidal. Someone's got to produce for the Chargers, right? These are the backs that we were just talking about, in the backfields we were just talking about, where guys could take over the backfields. I don't know who among that is going to have a really strong role or what have you, but I might find out in week 1 that Vidal's actually more of the offense than we thought, the way that Kyron Williams was last year. Or I might find out in week 1 that Rico Dowdle is like the 60 of a 60-40 with Zeke. I mean, that wouldn't be that surprising, right? Or Kendre Miller's very involved.
Early training camp depth chart reporting that pushes up the guys who are then going to immediately be displaced. And so it's not that you should assume that all of those reports are wrong. I think it's easy to get into the mindset of just believing every one of these reports is going to soon go the other direction. But as the prices for the nominal number 1 rise, don't chase those prices up or feel like those early camp reports are definitive, that is going to be what the season is like. That's how you end up with shares of a Cam Akers. Ben, Chase Brown in 12 games in 2022, he had 328 carries and still caught more than 2 passes a game. 328 carries in 12 games.
Yeah. I mean, was an absolute workhorse. Can certainly handle. A lot of people talk about how he didn't play a lot last year, only had like 50 touches. Had the one play where he clocked super fast, but, didn't do much else. And it's like, okay, but look back in college. He did do a lot. He handled a lot of work in college. Like that's why we always talk about stuff. And he came out and clocked the fastest time for a ball carrier last year. That's an additional point. But the main point is, look what he did in college, right? Like, this was already an intriguing late round profile going into last year. Somebody that you were talking about in later rounds of rookie drafts, I remember, as a low-key workhorse with some athleticism. That's the type of thing that we say, okay, if a day 3 running back's going to hit, it's somebody that's shown an ability to carry the ball a lot, be the centerpiece of his offense, has the athleticism, a little bit of size to back it up. Not the biggest back in the world, but
I mean, you can take the 32-year-old version of it, or you can take the second-year version.
It's a good profile. Anyway, this is it feels so straightforward. Sean, I clicked over to your Scott Fishbowl team to see if you were doing something similar, and I see that your last 4 picks have all been kickers. So it's a weird format. There's the kicker thing. You can flex kickers like crazy. I've been looking at kickers. It's different in each league how much people are actually playing into the different positions. I felt like running backs were valuable in my format. I almost took kickers a couple of times actually, but I love this that you've taken 4 straight kickers.
Sometimes you have to lean into the contrarian element there. Ben, as far as I can tell, the kicker is basically just a proxy for the offense. You get 3.3 points for a PAT.
Yeah, the extra points are worth a lot. And you've taken the Miami, Kansas City, Cincinnati, and Buffalo kickers. They score a lot of touchdowns. You're going to get a lot of kicker points.
When you get into the bye weeks, when you have all your people injured, when Jordan Addison decides that like you're allowed to break all the traffic laws, when JSN doesn't break out again, when Xavier Worthy is the wide receiver 3, I don't have to worry about any of that. I can just play my kickers.
Play the kickers.
They project to score more points anyway.
Yeah, I love it.
Well, Ben, this is one of my favorite shows every year, working through the running back dead zone, trying to place it into the context of the history, but then also the current season, what it means for 2024 and what it means in formats that are really very different and that have different incentives, that have different tensions, that have different trade-offs. We discussed Underdog Best Ball. We discussed FFPC Fantasy Pros contests. I love playing both. Ben, you and I are going to be drafting probably live on your YouTube channel next Monday night. Can we tease that?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay, so that will be in the Pros versus Joes contest. We came so close last year. I don't know. I still don't completely understand that format, but we finished second in our league, which isn't good enough. You need to win, right? So
I talked us into a Dawson Knox pick last year that I still regret.
Yeah, I don't know if that was the one that kept us from being first place, but
probably.
I'm sure that it wasn't. But I feel good about that team. It was fun. We had fun with it last year. We'll have fun with it this year. If you want to see how we're drafting some FFPC Best Ball teams, you can do that. The FFPC Best Ball Tournament is fantastic. Ben, I'm still jealous from a couple years ago where our buddy Connor just clipped me and Colin and Blair at the buzzer. Connor, obviously one of the best BBT players in the world. That's one of my favorite formats. We discussed some of the Superflex Best Ball Tournament over at the FFPC. That is my absolute favorite tournament. I'm sure we'll be doing some of those. And then as we get into August, you and I will be playing some main events. I can't wait for those either. But we hope you've enjoyed the long version of the show today. Make sure you are checking us out on the stream probably tonight. The full audio usually releases on Monday, and Monday night we will be streaming. So if you're listening to this, don't miss us there. We've got some other great stuff coming up for you. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch, whom you can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, at Stealing Lines. Ben mentioned his fantastic piece, the most important part or a key piece of Zero RB and why it's going to crush in 2024 is hiding in plain sight. You'll want to check that out. His Best Ball channel. He's doing a lot of Best Ball. His YouTube channel has been a smash hit. Get over there. Share those with him. We'd love to have you guys at RotoViz. Coupon code RVRadio 2024 for a 10% discount on your 1-year subscription. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.